"Can you come get me?" I didn't realize how dangerous that question was until I heard my own voice say it out loud, thin and shaking, like it didn't belong to me anymore. The concrete beneath me was cold enough to seep through my jeans, a steady chill climbing up my spine while the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like they were tired of staying awake this late, just like me. My phone screen was cracked in 3 places, a spiderweb of fractures cutting across Damian Rossi's name, and for a second I just stared at it, my thumb hovering, wondering when exactly my life had narrowed down to this one choice. Not 911. Not my sister. Not anyone normal. Him. I could still hear the echo of the urgent care doors slamming behind me, the faint hum of a vending machine somewhere down the row, the distant sound of a car engine turning over and pulling out into the street like the rest of the world was still moving, still normal, still untouched by whatever had just happened to me. My right arm throbbed in slow, unbearable pulses, each one sharper than the last, like my body was trying to send me a message I didn't want to understand. I pressed my shoulder back against the concrete pillar and forced myself to breathe, shallow, controlled, the way they taught us in training when a patient started to panic. Inhale, hold, exhale. It didn't help. Nothing helped. The truth was, I had seen this coming for weeks, maybe months, in the small moments I kept brushing aside, in the way I adjusted my sleeves without thinking, in the way I learned to read tone before words. And still, I had stayed. I had told myself I could handle it, that it wasn't that bad, that it wouldn't happen again, until it did. And now I was here, alone in a parking garage that smelled faintly of oil and rainwater, with a phone in my hand and a decision I couldn't take back. When I finally pressed call, it rang once, twice. Then his voice came through, low and steady, like nothing in the world could surprise him. Location. No greeting. No hesitation. Just that. I swallowed, my throat dry, and gave him the address, the level, the nearest entrance. I expected questions. I expected anger. Instead, there was a pause, just long enough for doubt to creep in, just long enough for me to realize I could still hang up, pretend this never happened, go back inside and sit under fluorescent lights and answer questions I didn't want to answer. But then he said, "Stay where you are," and the line went dead, just like that. I stared at my reflection in the black screen for a moment, barely recognizing the girl looking back at me. Hair out of place, eyes too wide, like she just stepped out of something she couldn't fully process yet. I told myself I had called him because I didn't have another option, because it was late, because I needed help. That was the story I wanted to believe. But deep down, somewhere under the fear and the pain and the noise in my head, I knew the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. I hadn't called Damian Rossi because he was the safest choice. I had called him because he was the only one who would actually do something about it. And as I sat there, listening to the faint echo of tires on concrete somewhere above me, I realized something that made my stomach tighten more than the pain in my arm ever could. I hadn't just asked someone to come get me. I had chosen what kind of man I was willing to owe. The first thing I noticed was the headlights, not the sound, not the engine, just the way the light cut across the concrete floor in a clean, controlled sweep like it belonged there, like everything else in this garage was temporary and that vehicle was not. I did not move. I told myself I would not move until I saw him, until I knew for sure this was real and not something I would regret the second it happened. The Escalade rolled in slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that made other cars feel careless by comparison, and it stopped exactly 20 feet from me, perfectly aligned with the painted lines as if even parking was something that required precision. The engine went quiet, but the presence did not. 2 doors opened first. Not his, never his, and 2 men stepped out in dark coats, scanning the space without rushing, without tension, just awareness that felt practiced and constant. They did not look at me right away. They looked at everything else first. Then finally his door opened. Damian stepped out like he had all the time in the world, like 2 in the morning in a parking garage in Brooklyn was exactly where he had planned to be. Same suit, same posture, not a single detail out of place. For a second, I wondered if he had been somewhere important before this, something formal, something that required that level of control, and the thought made my stomach twist because it meant I had pulled him out of a life that had nothing to do with mine and dropped him into this moment without warning. He walked toward me, not fast, not slow, just certain, and the closer he got, the quieter everything felt, like even the hum of the lights had lowered itself out of respect. He stopped a few feet away and his eyes moved, not randomly, not nervously, but with intent, taking in my face, my posture, and then finally my arm. He did not reach for it. He did not ask if I was okay. He just looked at it long enough that I felt seen in a way that was almost uncomfortable. "Who did this?" he asked, and his voice was exactly the same as it had been on the phone. Steady, controlled, like the answer would not change anything for him, like the outcome was already decided. I shook my head before I even thought about it. "It was an accident," I said, the lie coming out too quickly, too smooth, the way lies do when you have practiced them in your head for too long. His expression did not change. Not even a flicker. That was the part that made my chest tighten. He did not argue. He did not call me out. He just stepped closer and slipped his coat off in one clean motion, placing it around my shoulders with a kind of precision that felt less like comfort and more like containment, like he was securing something that mattered. The fabric was warm, heavier than I expected, and it carried a faint scent of something expensive and unfamiliar that did not belong in a place like this. I realized then that my hands were shaking, small, uncontrollable movements I had been ignoring until they were suddenly impossible to hide. His eyes dropped to them for a second, then, back to my face. "You waited too long," he said quietly, not accusing, not gentle either, just stating something that felt like a fact he had already accepted. I opened my mouth to respond but nothing came out, because the truth was I did not know how to explain the time between the first moment I knew something was wrong and the moment I finally called him. Behind him, one of the men opened the back door of the SUV, and Damien stepped aside slightly, not touching me, not guiding me, just making space. An invitation, not a command. That might have been the most unsettling part of all. I pushed myself up slowly, the movement sending a sharp wave through my arm that made my vision blur for half a second, but I kept going, because sitting there felt worse than whatever came next. As I moved past him, I felt it again, that awareness, like he was tracking every detail without needing to say anything. And when I finally slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my skin, the door closed with a quiet, final sound that echoed louder in my head than it should have. Damien got in on the other side a moment later, and as the vehicle began to move, smooth and silent, pulling out of the garage and into the empty street, I realized something I had not fully understood before. I had expected him to react, to show anger, to show something human that I could recognize and respond to. But what I got instead was something far more controlled, far more deliberate, and somehow far more dangerous. He was not here to react to what happened. He was here because he had already decided what would happen next. The city looked different from the back seat of Damien Rossi's car. Not brighter, not darker, just quieter. Like everything outside the tinted glass had been lowered to a background I was no longer part of. And I could feel it in the way the vehicle moved, smooth and uninterrupted, gliding through intersections without hesitation, as if the rules that slowed everyone else down did not apply here. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, watching streetlights stretch into thin lines across the glass, counting them without meaning to, anything to avoid looking directly at him, because every time I did, I felt that same awareness settle over me again, like I was being studied in a way that went beyond concern. My arm throbbed in steady waves, duller now but deeper, like the pain had settled in instead of spiking, and I realized at some point that I had stopped bracing against it, stopped reacting, as if my body had accepted that this was not temporary. The silence inside the car was not empty. It was controlled, intentional, and I found myself wondering if he preferred it that way or if he was waiting for me to break it. I did not trust what I might say if I tried. After what felt like both 10 minutes and an hour at the same time, the car slowed, then turned, then descended into another underground space, but this one was nothing like the first. Clean concrete, bright lighting, nostrai shopping carts, no oil stains, the kind of place that did not exist unless someone paid to make sure it stayed that way. The doors opened before I could reach for anything, and cool air rushed in, sharper here, carrying the faint scent of disinfectant and something clinical. One of the men offered a hand, not touching me, just there, steady, waiting. I ignored it and stepped out on my own, slower than I wanted to be, my balance off just enough to make me aware of it. Damien was already out, already moving, Not ahead of me, not behind me, but exactly where he needed to be to guide the direction without ever saying a word. We moved through a private elevator that required no button press I could see, just a soft chime and a smooth ascent that made my ears pop slightly. And when the doors opened, it was not a hospital the way I knew it. No crowded waiting room. No overhead announcements. No plastic chairs. Just a quiet hallway, polished floors, and a woman in scrubs already walking toward us like she had been expecting us down to the exact second. She did not ask my name. She did not ask what happened. She looked at Damien first, received a small nod, and then turned to me with a calm, practiced expression that made everything feel prearranged. "We are ready," she said, and for the first time since I made that call something inside me shifted, because ready meant this was not urgent in their world. It was scheduled, anticipated, like my situation had been slotted into a timeline I had never seen. They guided me into a room that looked more like a private suite than anything medical, soft lighting, clean surfaces, a large window that revealed the faint outline of Central Park in the distance, and as I sat down, carefully, slowly, I realized there were no forms to fill out, no clipboard, no insurance card, nothing that tied this place to the system I understood. A doctor entered, older, composed, speaking in a tone that did not rush me, did not question me, just explained what they would do, how they would help, and I nodded through most of it without fully processing the words, because my attention kept drifting back to the doorway where Damien stood. Not inside, not outside, just there, watching without interfering. When they asked if I was ready, I said yes, even though I was not sure what that meant anymore, and as the room softened at the edges, as the pain dulled into something distant, the last thing I registered clearly was him still standing there, exactly where I had seen him last, unchanged, unmoving, like time did not affect him the same way it affected everything else. When I opened my eyes again, the light had shifted, warmer now, softer, and my arm was secured, supported, no longer sending sharp signals through my body but resting in a controlled stillness that felt foreign after hours of tension. For a moment I did not move. I just listened. No machines beeping. No distant voices. Just quiet. Then I turned my head slightly, and he was still there, sitting now, but in the same position relative to the room, as if he had adjusted only enough to remain present. Same suit, same expression, meaning he had not left. Not once. I swallowed, my throat dry again, and the question slipped out before I could stop it. "How did you do this so fast?" He looked at me for a second, then reached to the side table and slid a thin folder into his hand, tapping it once before setting it down within my reach. "I did not do anything fast," he said. "I prepared early." I stared at the folder, then back at him, the meaning settling in slowly, heavily, and something in my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with pain. Because this was not about reacting to tonight. This was about something that had been waiting long before I ever picked up the phone. The folder felt heavier than it should have been when I pulled it onto my lap, like the weight had nothing to do with paper and everything to do with what it meant, and for a second I just stared at it, my fingers resting along the edge, tracing the clean line where it had been closed with deliberate care, as if opening it would shift something I could not put back. I glanced up at him, half expecting him to stop me, to say it was not time yet, but Damien did not move, did not speak, just watched with that same steady focus that made it impossible to pretend this was casual. I opened it slowly. The first page was a photograph. Not recent, not dramatic, just me, standing outside the clinic where I worked, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, looking like someone who believed her day would go exactly as planned. My breath caught, not because the image was shocking, but because it was ordinary, and that made it worse. I flipped to the next page. Another photo, different day, different angle, me again, walking into a grocery store, waiting at a crosswalk, sitting on a bench outside a laundromat. All moments I had never noticed were being observed. My chest tightened as I turned another page, expecting something worse, something darker, but what I found instead was a timeline, dates, locations, notes, not invasive, not detailed in a way that crossed a line, but precise enough to map a pattern. My pattern. "You have been tracking me?" I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Not accusing, not even surprised, just trying to place the reality in front of me into something I could understand. "No," he replied, and there was something almost subtle in the way he said it, like the correction mattered. I have been watching for change. I looked up at him then, really looked, trying to find something in his expression that would tell me this was normal in his world, that this was how he handled things, but there was nothing careless about. Nothing detached. This was intentional, personal. Why? I asked, because that was the only question that made sense anymore, and for the first time since he arrived, he did not answer immediately. He shifted slightly, leaning forward just enough to rest his forearms on his knees, his gaze lowering for a fraction of a second before returning to mine, and in that small movement something in the room changed. Not softer, not safer, just closer to the truth. 3 years ago, he said, and the words landed in a place I had not expected, pulling something loose in my memory before I could stop it. I did not want to follow it. I did anyway. A late shift, a headset pressing into my hair, a blinking light on a console that never stopped. Calls that blurred together until voices became patterns instead of people. And then one that did not. A boy, young, breathing too fast, not answering questions, not knowing where he was, just scared in a way that did not need explanation. I had stayed on that line longer than protocol allowed, longer than anyone told me to, ignoring the clock, ignoring the supervisor who kept signaling me to move on, because something about that call refused to feel like just another number. You kept him talking, Damien continued, and his voice was still steady, but there was something under it now, something controlled more tightly than before. Long enough for us to find him. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had shifted in without moving, and I shook my head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief at how something that small, something I had filed away as one of many moments that blurred into each other, could be standing here now in front of me, connected to him. That was just my job, I said, because it had been, because I needed it to stay that simple, but he did not accept that. No, he said quietly. It was a choice. The distinction settled heavier than the folder in my lap, because choices had consequences, and I was starting to see how far this one had traveled. I looked back down at the pages, at the careful way my life had been documented not as surveillance, but as observation, and the realization came slowly, piece by piece, fitting together in a way I could not ignore anymore. This was not about tonight. This was not about Travis. This was not even about the call I made in that parking garage. This had been set in motion long before any of that. So you waited? I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, and he did not look away when he answered. Yes. No hesitaste. No apology. Just truth. I closed the folder gently, my fingers lingering on the cover as I tried to steady the way everything inside me felt slightly off balance, like I had stepped onto something that looked solid but shifted under pressure. For what? I asked, even though I was not sure I wanted to hear it. His gaze held mine, unwavering, certain in a way that made it impossible to misunderstand what he was about to say. For you to need me, he replied, and in that moment, I understood something that changed everything about the call I had made, about the man sitting across from me, about the line I thought I had crossed tonight. I had not stepped into his world by accident. I had stepped into something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the exact moment I would reach for it myself. For you to need me. The words did not echo in the room, but they stayed in my head like they had been carved there, repeating in a way that made it impossible to move past them. And for a moment I just sat there with the folder still resting on my lap, trying to decide whether I should feel relieved or unsettled, because I could not tell the difference anymore. I let out a slow breath and looked down at my arm, now secured, supported, no longer sharp with pain but heavy with consequence. And I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way than before. He had not reacted when I called him. He had responded like someone who had already made a decision long before that moment. So what happens now? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, because I needed something clear, something simple, something that made sense in a way the rest of this did not. Damien did not answer right away. He reached for the folder, opened it again, and turned it slightly so I could see the pages more clearly. But this time it was not photographs of me. It was documents, financial statements, employment records, Dates and notes that had nothing to do with my life directly but everything to do with the person I had tried not to think about since I left that parking garage. My stomach dropped before I even focused on the name at the top of the page. Travis Cole. The letters looked different on paper, colder somehow, stripped of the familiarity that had once made them feel safe. You said it was an accident, Damien said, his tone unchanged, not pressing, not accusing, just placing the statement back in front of me like he expected me to examine it again. I swallowed, my throat tightening as I looked away from the page for a second. But there was nowhere else to look that did not lead back to the same truth. It does not matter what I say, I replied quietly, because part of me already knew that whatever story I tried to hold on to would not survive in this room. He tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in consideration, like he was measuring something I could not see. It matters to you, he said, and that was the problem. It did, more than I wanted to admit. I looked back at the documents, forcing myself to focus, and the more I read, the less familiar everything became. Numbers that did not line up. Payments that had no explanation. Job records that showed gaps I had never noticed because I had never looked that closely. What is this? I asked, my voice sharper now, not from anger, but from the growing sense that I had been standing inside something I did not fully understand. Pattern, he replied simply. Behavior. Risk. I shook my head, a small movement, but enough to push back against the calm certainty in his voice. You are talking about him like he is a case, I said, and this time there was a hint of something under my words, something closer to frustration. Damien met my gaze without hesitation. He is, he said, and there was no hesitation in that either. No emotion. Just clarity. That should have made me feel better. It did not, because if Travis was a case, then what did that make me? I leaned back slightly, careful of my arm, the movement. Slow but deliberate as I tried to create some distance between myself and the weight of what I was looking at. So you are going to what? I asked, the question forming before I could soften it. Make him disappear. Fix it. The words felt wrong even as I said them, like they belonged to a version of the situation I did not want to accept but could not ignore. For the first time since I had known him, Damien's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, a small tightening around his eyes, a brief pause that told me I had said something important, even if it was not correct. No, he said, and the word landed heavier than anything else he had said so far. That is easy. I frowned slightly, not understanding, and he continued, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Ending something quickly removes it. It does not resolve it. I stared at him, trying to follow the logic, trying to place myself inside it, but it did not fit the way I expected it to. Then what are you doing? I asked, because I needed to understand the direction of this. Needed to know where I stood in whatever plan he had already decided on. He closed the folder slowly, the motion controlled, final, and set it back on the table between us like it was a boundary line. I am removing his options, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made my breath catch, not out of fear, but because I could hear the structure behind it, the layers, the intention. Every one of them. I felt a chill run through me, not from the room, not from the night, but from the realization settling in piece by piece. This was not about reacting to what had happened. This was not about one moment, one mistake, one night. This was about everything that led to it, everything that allowed it, everything that made it possible for me to end up on that cold concrete floor in the first place. And as I sat there, looking at the man who had been waiting for me to make that call, I understood something that made my chest tighten in a way that was almost unfamiliar. I had not called him for revenge. Had called him for something far more dangerous. I had called him for a solution. The room felt different once the conversation stopped. Not quieter, not louder, just heavier. Like everything that had been said was still sitting in the air between us, refusing to disappear, and I found myself staring at the closed folder on the table like it might open again on its own and change what I had just understood. Damien stood first, smooth and unhurried, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve in a motion that looked almost automatic, like control was not something he turned on, it was something he never turned off. You should rest, he said, and there was no question in it, No softness meant to persuade me, just a statement placed where it could not be ignored. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding and shifted slightly on the bed, the movement pulling at my arm just enough to remind me that my body was still catching up to everything else that had happened tonight. And then what? I asked, because rest implied a pause, and nothing about this felt like it was going to pause for long. He glanced toward the window for a second, the faint glow of the city reflecting off the glass, then back to me. Then you stay, he said. The word landed differently than everything else he had said so far. Stay. Not go home. Not leave. Stay. I frowned slightly, trying to process the implication behind it. For how long? I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I was starting to understand that the answer might not be simple. Until it is safe, he replied. And there it was again, that same calm certainty that left no room for argument, like safety was not something I got to define anymore. I shook my head slightly, a small instinctive reaction. My apartment is fine, I said, even though part of me knew that was not entirely true anymore. Not after everything I had just seen, not after everything he had just shown me. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked closer, stopping just within the edge of my space, not crossing into it, not invading, but close enough that I could feel the shift in presence. Your apartment is known, he said quietly. Your routine is known. Your patterns are predictable. Each word was measured, deliberate, not meant to scare me, but they did anyway, not because of how he said them, but because of how easily they made sense. I looked down at my hands, at the slight tremor that had not fully gone away, and for the first time since I left that parking garage, I felt something different from fear or confusion. I felt exposed. So what? I said, trying to hold on to something that felt like control. I just stay here. With you. The last two words came out before I could soften them, and for a second, something shifted in his expression again. Subtle, almost unnoticeable, but there. You stay where you are protected, he corrected, and the distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. I leaned back slightly, the soft fabric of the pillow supporting me as I tried to think through the reality of what he was saying. This was not an offer. It was a solution, a controlled environment, a place where variables could be managed, where outcomes could be predicted. And the unsettling part was not that it made sense. It was that it made more sense than anything else I had considered. A nurse entered quietly, checking my vitals, adjusting the position of my arm with careful hands. Her presence brief and efficient, and when she left, the room settled back into that same controlled silence, like nothing here was ever accidental. I glanced toward the door, then back at Damien. And if I say no, I asked because I needed to know if that option still existed, if I still existed in a way that allowed me to choose. He held my gaze, steady, unflinching, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might push, might explain why that was not an option. He did not. Then I make sure you are safe somewhere else, he said, and there was something in that answer that caught me off guard, not because of what it promised, but because of what it did not take away. He was not trapping me. He was positioning me, and somehow that felt even more dangerous. I looked away, toward the window, toward the faint outline of the city I had always known, trying to place myself back into it, trying to remember what normal felt like before tonight, before the call, before the realization that I had stepped into something much bigger than I understood. But the longer I sat there, the more distant that version of my life felt, like something I could see but not reach anymore. Behind me, I heard the quiet sound of a chair being moved, the subtle shift of fabric as Damien sat down again, not leaving, not stepping away, just staying, exactly where he had been since the moment I opened my eyes. And as I stared out at the city lights, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else he had said. I was not being forced to stay. I was choosing between two versions of danger. One I already knew, and one that was watching me closely, waiting for me to decide if I trusted it. I did not sleep the way people think sleep works, not deeply, not fully, just drifting in and out of something that felt more like my body shutting down in pieces while my mind stayed awake, replaying everything in fragments that refused to settle into a single version of the night, and every time I opened my eyes, the room looked exactly the same, like nothing here was allowed to change unless someone decided it should. The light through the window had shifted by the time I finally pushed myself up slightly, careful of my arm, the movement slow and deliberate, and for a second I forgot where I was, the quiet too complete, the air too still, until I turned my head and saw him again, in a different chair this time, closer to the window, a phone in his hand, his posture relaxed but not distracted, like even rest for him was something controlled. He glanced up the moment I moved, not surprised, not caught off guard, just aware, and that alone told me he had been paying attention the entire time. "You should not be awake yet," he said, his voice low, not sharp, just observant, like he was noting a deviation in a pattern. "I am fine," I replied automatically, even though we both knew that was not true, not physically, not in any way that mattered. He did not argue. He just studied me for a second longer before setting his phone aside, and something in the way he did it made me feel like whatever he had been looking at was more important than he was letting on. "Did something happen?" I asked, because the air in the room felt different, heavier than it had been before I closed my eyes, like something had shifted while I was not paying attention. He stood, walking toward me with the same measured pace, stopping at the foot of the bed instead of coming closer, and for a moment he did not speak, which was enough to confirm that yes, something had happened. "Your sister," he said finally, and the words hit faster than anything else had so far, sharper than the pain in my arm, more immediate than the fear that had been sitting quietly in the background all night. "Mia," I said, sitting up a little too quickly before I caught myself, the sudden movement pulling at my arm and forcing me to slow down, to breathe, to focus. "What about her?" Damien's expression did not change, but there was something different in his eyes now, something more focused, more precise. "She was followed this morning," he said, and the room seemed to tilt slightly, not physically, but enough that I had to steady myself with my good hand against the mattress. "Followed?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth, like it belonged in someone else's life, not mine, not hers. "By who?" He did not answer that directly. Instead, he reached for the folder again, pulling out a single photograph and placing it on the table within my reach. I leaned forward slightly, my breath catching as I focused on the image. Mia, walking out of a campus building, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her head turned slightly like she had heard something behind her, and a car, parked just across the street. Subtle, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. But I was looking now, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. "This was not random," Damien said, his voice steady, grounding in a way that almost made it worse. "He is not acting alone." My chest tightened, a slow, creeping pressure that made it hard to breathe evenly, and I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against what he was implying. "No," I said, quieter now, more to myself than to him. "Travis would not." I stopped because the truth was I did not know what Travis would or would not do anymore. Not after everything I had just learned. Not after seeing the version of him laid out in documents instead of memories. "You said this was about him?" I continued, forcing the words out, trying to hold on to something that felt contained, manageable. Damien met my gaze without hesitation. "It started with him," he corrected, and that distinction settled heavier than anything else. I looked back at the photo, at Mia, at the life she was still living without realizing how close something else had come to touching it, and a new kind of fear took hold, not sharp, not immediate, but deeper, more rooted, because this was not just about me anymore. This was about her. "So what does that mean?" I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, because beneath it, everything felt like it was shifting again. He did not look away. "It means you were never just the target," he said quietly. "You were access." The word landed differently than anything else had so far, because it reframed everything, not as something that had happened to me, but as something I had been used for without even realizing it. I sat back slowly, the realization settling in piece by piece, connecting moments I had ignored, conversations I had dismissed, details I had chosen not to question. And as I stared at that photograph, at the evidence that this had already reached beyond me, I understood something that made the decision from last night feel smaller than it had before. I had thought calling Damien brought danger into my life, But the truth was, the danger had already been there. I just had not seen it until now. The word access did not leave my head. It stayed there, repeating in a quiet, steady rhythm that made everything else feel distant, like the room, the city, even the pain in my arm had all stepped back to make space for something I could not ignore anymore, and I kept staring at the photograph of Mia like if I looked long enough I could somehow reverse it, erase the moment before it ever happened. She does not know, I said finally, my voice lower now, more controlled than I felt, because the idea of her being watched without understanding it made something in me tighten in a way that was sharper than fear. Damien did not answer right away, which told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. No, he said, and that single word carried a weight I had not expected, not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it implied. She had been living her life normally, going to class, walking across campus, laughing with friends, completely unaware that someone had decided she mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with her. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself to breathe evenly, because panic would not help her, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt something different take shape inside me. Not confusion, not hesitation, something closer to clarity. You said he is not acting alone, I said, lifting my eyes to meet his again, holding his gaze this time instead of avoiding it. Then who is? Damien studied me for a moment like he was deciding how much to give me, how much I could handle, and I realized that whatever answer he had was not simple, not something that would fit neatly into the version of events I had been telling myself. That is what we are confirming, he replied. But there was something in his tone that told me he already knew more than he was saying. I shook my head slightly, not accepting that. Not this time. No, I said more firmly now. You do not wait this long without knowing something. You said you prepared. So tell me. The room went still in a different way then, like I had stepped across a line I had not realized was there, and for a brief second I wondered if I had pushed too far, if this was the moment he would pull back, close off, return to that controlled distance he had kept since the beginning. But he did not. He reached into the folder again, slower this time, more deliberate, and pulled out a different document, sliding it across to me with the same precision as before. Your sister's financial records, he said, and I felt my stomach drop before I even looked down, because Mia's life had always been simple, straightforward, the kind of path I had worked hard to make sure she could have. School, scholarships, part-time job, nothing complicated, nothing hidden. I looked at the page, scanning the lines quickly at first, then slower, more carefully, and that was when I saw it. Payment. Small enough to ignore if you were not paying attention. Then another, and another. Not regular, not consistent, but there. What is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now, because something about it felt wrong in a way I could not immediately explain. Support, Damien said. Indirect. Structured to look like financial aid adjustments. I frowned, trying to process that, trying to make it fit into something that made sense. Mia does not have any outside support, I said. She would have told me. He held my gaze, steady, unwavering. She did not know, he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else, because that meant this had been happening without her awareness, without her consent, quietly shaping something she believed she had earned on her own. I shook my head again, slower this time, trying to connect the pieces, trying to understand who would do that and why. Travis does not have that kind of money, I said, because that much I knew, that much I could still hold on to. Damien nodded slightly. No, he agreed. He does not. The silence that followed felt sharper than anything else, because it filled itself with the answer before he even said it, and when he did, it was quiet, almost too quiet for how much it changed. His mother does. I froze, the name settling into place before I could stop it. Nora Cole. Someone I had met only a handful of times. Someone who had always seemed distant but polite. Controlled in a way that never raised questions because it never needed to. She works in legal support? I said slowly, more to myself than to him, pieces falling into place in a way that made my chest tighten. She understands documentation, systems. Damien did not interrupt. He let me get there on my own, and when I did, it felt worse than if he had just told me. This was planned, I whispered, the realization settling in fully now, not as a possibility, but as a fact I could not avoid. Not just him. Not just what happened last night. I looked back at the photo of Mia, then at the documents, then finally at him, and for the first time since I had picked up that phone, I understood the full shape of what I had stepped into. They were building something? I said, my voice steadier now, clearer, even as everything inside me shifted again. Damien nodded once, slow, certain. Yes, he said. And you were already inside it before you realized it existed. The word access did not leave my head. It stayed there, repeating in a quiet, steady rhythm that made everything else feel distant, like the room, the city, even the pain in my arm had all stepped back to make space for something I could not ignore anymore. And I kept staring at the photograph of Mia like if I looked long enough I could somehow reverse it, erase the moment before it ever happened. She does not know, I said finally, my voice lower now, more controlled than I felt, because the idea of her being watched without understanding it made something in me tighten in a way that was sharper than fear. Damien did not answer right away, which told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. No, he said, and that single word carried a weight I had not expected, not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it implied. She had been living her life normally, going to class, walking across campus, laughing with friends, completely unaware that someone had decided she mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with her. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself to breathe evenly, because panic would not help her, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt something different take shape inside me. Not confusion, not hesitation, something closer to clarity. You said he is not acting alone, I said, lifting my eyes to meet his again, holding his gaze this time instead of avoiding it. Then who is? Damien studied me for a moment like he was deciding how much to give me, how much I could handle, and I realized that whatever answer he had was not simple, not something that would fit neatly into the version of events I had been telling myself. That is what we are confirming, he replied. But there was something in his tone that told me he already knew more than he was saying. I shook my head slightly, not accepting that, not this time. No, I said more firmly now. You do not wait this long without knowing something. You said you prepared. So tell me. The room went still in a different way then, like I had stepped across a line I had not realized was there, and for a brief second I wondered if I had pushed too far, if this was the moment he would pull back, close off, return to that controlled distance he had kept since the beginning. But he did not. He reached into the folder again, slower this time, more deliberate, and pulled out a different document, sliding it across to me with the same precision as before. Your sister's financial records, he said, and I felt my stomach drop before I even looked down, because Mia's life had always been simple, straightforward, the kind of path I had worked hard to make sure she could have. School, scholarships, part-time job, nothing complicated, nothing hidden. I looked at the page, scanning the lines quickly at first, then slower, more carefully, and that was when I saw it. Payment. Small enough to ignore if you were not paying attention. Then another. And another. Not regular. Not consistent. But there. What is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now, because something about it felt wrong in a way I could not immediately explain. Support, Damien said. Indirect. Structured to look like financial aid adjustments. I frowned, trying to process that, trying to make it fit into something that made sense. Mia does not have any outside support, I said. She would have told me. He held my gaze, steady, unwavering. She did not know, he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else, because that meant this had been happening without her awareness, without her consent, quietly shaping something she believed she had earned on her own. I shook my head again, slower this time, trying to connect the pieces, trying to understand who would do that and why. Travis does not have that kind of money, I said, because that much I knew, that much I could still hold on to. Damien nodded slightly. No, he agreed. He does not. The silence that followed felt sharper than anything else, because it filled itself with the answer before he even said it, and when he did, it was quiet, almost too quiet. For how much it changed. His mother does. I froze, the name settling into place before I could stop it. Nora Cole. Someone I had met only a handful of times. Someone who had always seemed distant but polite, controlled in a way that never raised questions because it never needed to. She works in legal support? I said slowly, more to myself than to him, pieces falling into place in a way that made my chest tighten. She understands documentation, systems. Damien did not interrupt. He let me get there on my own, and when I did, it felt worse than if he had just told me. This was planned, I whispered, the realization settling in fully now, not as a possibility, but as a fact I could not avoid. Not just him. Not just what happened last night. I looked back at the photo of Mia, then at the documents, then finally at him, and for the first time since I had picked up that phone, I understood the full shape of what I had stepped into. They were building something? I said, my voice steadier now, clearer, even as everything inside me shifted again. Damien nodded once, slow, certain. Yes, he said, and you were already inside it before you realized it existed. Leaving felt quieter than I expected, not dramatic, not rushed, just a series of small decisions that added up to something irreversible, and I realized that was what made it harder, because there was no single moment I could point to and say this is when everything changed. It was just me sitting there in that room, looking at the photograph of Mia, looking at the documents, and understanding that staying meant stepping further into a world where I would never fully belong, no matter how safe it felt. I cannot stay here, I said finally, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, because the fear was still there, the uncertainty was still there, but something else had taken its place, something stronger, something that did not want to disappear into someone else's protection no matter how well-intentioned it was. Damien did not interrupt. He did not argue. He just watched, the way he always did, like he was measuring not my words, but the reason behind them. If I stay, I continued, forcing myself to hold his gaze. Then, I stopped being part of my own life. The words settled between us, heavier than anything else I had said so far, because they were not about him, not really, they were about me, about the line I was trying to draw before it disappeared completely. He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and for a moment I thought he might push back, might explain why this was not the right decision, why safety mattered more than independence, but instead he nodded once, small, controlled, like he had already considered this outcome before I said it out loud. Then we adjust, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because I had expected resistance, not accommodation. You leave, he continued, but not without structure. I frowned slightly, trying to understand what that meant in his world. You go somewhere your patterns do not follow you, he said, and I could hear it in the way he spoke, the planning already forming, the pieces already moving into place. Temporary housing, no direct connections, limited visibility. It sounded less like a suggestion and more like a system, something designed to minimize risk in a way I would never have thought to do on my own. And Mia? I asked, because that was the part that mattered most, the part one could not leave unresolved. His expression shifted slightly, not softer, not colder, just more focused. She will be monitored, he said, not followed, not approached, observed. I nodded slowly because I understood the difference now, understood the language he used, the precision behind it. She cannot know, I added, my voice quieter, because the idea of pulling her into this, even indirectly, felt wrong in a way I could not justify. She will not, he replied, and there was no hesitation in that, no uncertainty, just certainty that he would keep that boundary intact. The room fell into a different kind of silence then, not tense, not uncertain, just final in a way that made everything feel more real. I looked around one last time at the controlled space, the clean lines, the quiet that had started to feel almost comfortable, and I understood why leaving mattered, because comfort like this came with a cost I was not ready to pay. When I stood, it was slower than I wanted, my body still catching up, my arm reminding me of everything that had led to this moment, but I did not stop, did not hesitate, because if I did, I was not sure I would move at all. Damien stepped back slightly, giving me space without needing to be asked, and that small gesture made something in my chest tighten in a way I did not expect, because it meant he understood, even if he did not agree. Where will I go? I asked, because that was the one piece I could not solve on my own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, plain, unmarked except for a single number written in clean, deliberate ink, and handed it to me without explanation. Westchester, he said. You will be met there. I took the card, the paper light in my hand but heavy with implication, and for a moment I just looked at it, at the path it represented, at the distance it would put between me and everything I had known. And you? I said before I could stop myself, the question forming without permission. What happens now? He held my gaze, steady, unchanged. But there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before. Something less controlled, less distant. Now, he said quietly, I finish what they started. The words settled into me slowly, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as something inevitable, something already in motion whether I stayed or left. I nodded once, not because I agreed with everything, but because I understood enough to move forward, and as I turned toward the door, toward whatever came next, I realized something that made the decision feel both heavier and clearer at the same time. I was not walking away from him. I was walking toward a version of myself that still had the right to choose. The drive out of Manhattan felt longer than it should have been, not because of traffic or distance, but because every mile that passed seemed to stretch something inside me that I had been holding tight for too long, and I sat in the back seat of a different car this time. Not the Escalade, not something that announced itself, just a quiet, unmarked sedan that moved through the early morning light like it belonged to no one. The skyline faded behind us slowly, glass towers giving way to lower buildings. Then, open roads, then stretches of trees that looked almost unreal after so much concrete. And I kept my eyes on the window, watching the city disappear like a version of my life I had already stepped out of. My arm was secured against my side, the dull ache still there but manageable. A constant reminder that this was not a dream, not something I could wake up from and return to normal. The man driving did not speak. He did not need to. Everything about this felt arranged, precise, like I had been placed into a system that knew exactly where I was going even if I did not. When we finally turned off the main road, the change was immediate. Narrower streets, fewer houses, larger spaces between them, the kind of quiet that was not empty, but protected. The car slowed in front of a white house set back from the road, surrounded by tall trees that filtered the morning light into soft, shifting patterns across the driveway. It did not look like a safe house. It looked like somewhere someone chose to live. That made it harder to process. The driver stepped out first, opening my door without a word, and I followed, slower, taking in the details without meaning to. The clean porch, the trimmed grass, the absence of anything that felt out of place. Inside, he said finally, his voice neutral, not unkind, just direct. I nodded and walked up the steps, each one grounding me a little more in the reality of where I was. And when the door opened, it was not another man in a suit waiting for me. It was a woman, late 50s, maybe early 60s, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, her expression calm in a way that felt earned, not practiced. Claire, she said, like she had known me longer than 5 seconds, and for a moment I just stood there, caught off guard by how normal she seemed in a situation that was anything but. Come in, she added, stepping aside, and I hesitated only for a second before crossing the threshold. The house smelled faintly of coffee and something warm, something familiar, and it hit me unexpectedly, the contrast between this and everything that had happened over the last 24 hours, the way my life had shifted from cold concrete to controlled silence to this, something that felt almost like safety but not quite the same kind. I am Eleanor, she said as she closed the door behind me, her voice steady, grounding in a way that made me realize how much I needed that right now. You will be staying here for a while. I nodded slowly, taking in the living room, the soft light, the absence of tension, and for the first time since I made that call, my shoulders dropped slightly, just enough to feel the difference. Thank you, I said, because it felt like the right thing to say, even if I did not fully understand what I was stepping into yet. She studied me for a moment, not invasive, not distant, just attentive, like she was reading something I had not said out loud. You are not here because you are weak, she said quietly, and the words caught me off guard more than anything else had so far, because they addressed something I had not admitted even to myself. You are here because someone decided you mattered. I swallowed, the weight of that settling in slowly, and for a moment I did not know how to respond because part of me wanted to reject it, to hold on to the idea that I had made this choice entirely on my own, but another part of me knew that was not completely true. I stepped further into the room, setting my bag down carefully, my movements slower now, more deliberate, like I was trying to anchor myself in something that would not shift under me again. "Does he know I am here?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, because everything about this had his presence in it, even if he was not physically here. Eleanor gave a small, knowing nod. "He always knows where you are," she said, and there was no fear in her tone, no warning, just a simple statement of fact that made something in my chest tighten and settle at the same time. I looked toward the window, toward the quiet stretch of trees beyond it, and for the first time since I left the city, I allowed myself to feel the distance, not just in miles but in everything else, the space between who I had been and who I was becoming. And as I stood there, in a place that was both unfamiliar and carefully prepared, I realized something that shifted the way I saw everything that had happened so far. I had thought leaving would put space between me and Damian Rossi. But the truth was, I had only moved deeper into something he had already built around me long before I ever understood it existed. The first morning in that house did not feel like safety. It felt like silence learning how to breathe again, and I woke up before the sun fully settled over the trees, my body still wired like something might happen if I closed my eyes too long. But nothing did, just the quiet hum of a place untouched by urgency, untouched by the constant pressure I had grown used to ignoring. I sat at the edge of the bed, my arms still secured, the ache now dull and manageable, and for the first time in days, maybe longer, I noticed something strange. There was no anticipation of the next problem. No instinct to check my phone. No need to calculate someone else's mood before I moved. Felt wrong. Too still. Too open. I stepped into the hallway slowly, the wooden floor cool under my feet, and followed the faint sound of movement toward the kitchen, where Eleanor was already awake. Standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand like this was just another normal morning in a life that had never intersected with anything complicated. She glanced up when I entered, her expression calm, almost knowing. "You slept?" she said, not as a question, and I nodded once because I had, even if it had not felt complete. "That is a good sign," she added, turning back to the stove where something warm and simple filled the air. The kind of smell that made me realize how long it had been since I had eaten without tension sitting in my chest. I leaned against the counter carefully, watching her move with an ease that felt intentional, like everything she did was meant to create stability in a space that needed it. "What happens now?" I asked, because even here, even in this quiet, I knew this was not the end of anything, just a pause in a larger process I was only beginning to understand. She set the cup down, turning to face me fully this time, her eyes steady in a way that reminded me of him, but without the weight of control behind it. "Now you begin to separate what was done to you from who you are," she said, and the words landed differently than anything else I had heard so far, because they were not about plans or protection or outcomes, they were about me, about something internal I had not had time to examine. I frowned slightly, trying to follow that, trying to place myself inside it. "I already left," I said, because that had felt like the hardest part, the most definitive step I could take. Eleanor shook her head gently. "Leaving a place is not the same as leaving its influence," she replied, and that stopped me in a way I was not prepared for, because it was true in a way I had not fully acknowledged yet. I looked down at my hands, at the subtle tension still sitting there, the instinct to brace for something that was not coming, and I realized how much of me was still shaped by what I had just stepped away from. "So I just stay here?" I asked, quieter now, not resisting, just trying to understand the path in front of me. "For a while," she said, "but not to hide." She moved toward the table, setting down a plate, simple, warm, real, and gestured for me to sit. "You stay to rebuild something that belongs to you." I sat slowly, the chair grounding me in a way that felt unfamiliar, and for a moment I just looked at the food in front of me, at the normalcy of it, at how something so simple could feel so distant from everything that had happened. "And him," I said before I could stop myself, because even here, even now, Damian was still part of this, whether I wanted him to be or not. Eleanor did not look surprised by the question. She never did. "He is doing what he does," she replied, and there was no need to explain further. No need to describe the details, because I already understood enough to know that whatever was happening, it was controlled, deliberate, and already in motion. I picked up the fork slowly, my movements more steady now, and took a breath before I spoke again. "And when it is over?" I asked, because that was the part one could not see yet, the part that still felt uncertain. She watched me for a moment, her expression softening just enough to feel human instead of composed. "Then you decide what your life looks like without fear defining it," she said, and that was the first time anyone had framed it that way, not as survival, not as escape, but as a choice that belonged entirely to me. I nodded slowly, the weight of that settling in, and for the first time since I made that call, something inside me shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was beginning to shape what came next. The days stopped feeling like days and started feeling like something steadier, something that did not rush me forward or pull me backward, just held me in place long enough for me to notice the difference between who I had been and who I was becoming, and it was not dramatic, not something I could point to and say this is where everything changed. It was smaller than that, quieter, like the way my hands stopped shaking when I reached for a glass or the way I no longer checked the door twice before going to sleep. Time passed in ways I did not track, measured more by the way my thoughts slowed down than by any clock on the wall, and eventually the world outside that house stopped feeling like something I needed to avoid and started feeling like something I could step back into on my own terms. The call came on a morning that felt no different than the others, soft light through the trees, the faint sound of wind moving through leaves, and Eleanor standing by the window like she already knew what was coming before I did. She did not say anything at first. She just handed me the phone. I stared at it for a second, my reflection faint in the dark screen, and then I took it, my fingers steady in a way they had not been the last time I held something like this. "It is done," Damien said when I answered, his voice exactly the same as it had always been, controlled, measured, but there was something under it now, something quieter, like the weight he carried had shifted in a way I could not see. I did not ask what done meant. I did not need to. Some things did not require details to be understood. "Mia is safe," he continued, and that was the only part that mattered, the only part that settled something deep in my chest that I had been holding on to since the moment I saw that photograph. I let out a breath slowly, my eyes closing for just a second as the tension I had been carrying without realizing it finally eased. "Thank you," I said, and this time it was not automatic, not something said out of habit, it was real, grounded in everything that had happened between us, everything that had been done without being asked. There was a pause on the line, not long, but long enough to feel intentional, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, not weaker, just different. "Where are you?" he asked, and the question landed in a way I had not expected, because it was not about location, not really, it was about something else, something I had to decide how to answer. I looked around the room, at the quiet, at the life I had started to rebuild piece by piece, and then I looked at the window, at the world beyond it that no longer felt unreachable. "I am exactly where I chose to be," I said, and for the first time since I had known him, I heard something in his silence that felt like understanding instead of control. "Good," he replied, and there was no argument, no attempt to pull me back into his world, just acceptance that felt earned rather than given. We did not say goodbye. We did not need to. Some connections did not require closure to exist. Later that afternoon, I stood outside for the first time without thinking about who might be watching, the air cool against my skin, the ground steady beneath my feet, and I realized how different everything felt when fear was no longer the thing guiding every decision. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the card he had given me. The ink still clear, the number still there, and for a moment I just held it, not as something I needed, but as something I could choose. That was the difference. Now, not dependence, not escape, choice. I pulled my phone out slowly, scrolling through my contacts until I found his name again. The same name that had once felt like a last resort, a line I had crossed without fully understanding what it meant. This time it felt different, not heavy, not desperate, just intentional. I pressed call and lifted the phone to my ear, listening as it rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, steady as always. "Yes." I let out a small breath, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from something quieter, something closer to clarity. "Can you come get me?" I said, and this time, the words did not come from a place of needing to be saved. They came from a place of choosing who I allowed into my life. There was no pause on his end this time. "No hesitación. I am already on my way," he replied, and as I lowered the phone, the faintest smile touched my lips, not because everything was perfect, not because the past had disappeared, but because for the first time, the future felt like something I was walking toward instead of something I was running from. He could have the world if he wanted it. But now, if he wanted me, it would be because I chose to stand there and meet him halfway.